It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Can South Korea and Japan overcome their differences and build friendly relations? Seoul's Foreign Minister Park Jin has been in Tokyo since Monday to pay his respects to the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was shot dead earlier this month at a rally in central Japan. Well, Park met with his Japanese counterpart there, Yoshimasa Hayashi, and the two agreed to work together on the nuclear threat from North Korea, as well as both of them expressing the need to overcome their differences on historical issues, including Japan's colonial-era forced mobilization of Korean laborers. Hoping to take the next step in restoring bilateral ties, Park conveyed South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's message to Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, telling him of Seoul's hopes for friendly and cooperative relations and a potential summit between the two leaders. We discuss what's on the cards for the two countries and what a future-oriented relationship would look like. We welcome Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London, and Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Warm welcome to you both for joining us. And, well, my first question to you, Dr. Cronin. Now, Mr. Park Jin, his visit marks the first visit of a Korean foreign minister to Tokyo in nearly 5 years. Do you think this really sets the tone for better relations between the two neighbours? And how do you see the possibility of a possible summit taking place between President Yoon and PM Kishida?
Well, this is a very positive development, there's no doubt. As you point out, nearly 5 years for the foreign minister to visit. The good news is that President Yoon has shown real political will to improve this relationship, which is critical, I think, for both Korea and Japan, as well as for the region. The fact that Park Jin is managing this policy is also a good sign. He's a professional. He knows that it's easy to declare your intent to have a good policy. It's much harder to actually build trust when you've had an absence of trust over the last few years. So he knows that this will take small steps, but I think this is really exactly the necessary first step. And Foreign Minister Hayashi, as well, from Japan, is a professional. He's going to be fair-minded, but he's going to be cautious per his prime minister's instructions. So this is going to take some time, but I think this is moving in the right direction.
Certainly, Professor Pacheco-Pardo, it seems that both sides are very eager to mend the ties that hit possibly their lowest point in decades in 2019, but they need to come up with new solutions to very old issues. Do you think there has been any progress on that front? I mean, what do you think the status of their talks is right now?
I think we're starting to see some progress. Yes, I think that we have seen both Korea and Japan indicating that a political solution may be on its way. Of course, there is the legal issue within the South Korean courts, but there is also the willingness by the two governments to also reach a political agreement that can withstand the test of time. And I think that's going to be crucial. But I do think that both President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida have indicated through their interlocutors that they are willing to find common ground and they're willing to focus on what is positive in the relationship and try to address these historical issues in parallel, but without interrupting or even stopping the cooperation between the two countries, between Korea and Japan.
And Dr. Cronin, well, a future-oriented relationship, now that's been a term that's been overused over the past decade. We've heard it time and time again, but obviously it's been more easily and frequently said than actually done. What kind of working level talks or efforts do you think are being made right now or could be made in order to take that practical first step towards improving bilateral ties?
Well, I think a realistic assessment of the world right now is that there are a lot of problems, and they may get worse in the coming months and this next winter when you think about energy shutdown, continuation of war, perhaps in Ukraine, problems with North Korean nuclear tests. There's no shortage of challenges out there, so it's very important for Japan and Korea to seriously engage, roll up their sleeves, engage in effective working group meetings on issues from supply chain resilience and technology cooperation, to just starting with more exchanges. And the fact that there was an announcement of resumed or increased flights between Seoul and Tokyo, I think is a good start, because those kind of exchanges will build a long-term relationship. And forward-looking means looking forward for the next generation and beyond, not just the next few months. So both short-term and long-term, policy coordination on the economy, on supply chain, on COVID, on dealing with North Korea. There's no shortage of issues on which to cooperate.
Professor Pacheco-Pardo, now when it comes to cooperating, the cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo on North Korean nuclear issues, how do you expect them to make, what kind of progress do you expect to see? For instance, the talks on Jusomia, restoring that. How do you think the talks are going to go?
I think that's going to be a first step. I think we're going to see more intelligence sharing between Korea and Japan, of course, also with the US. I think the two governments have indicated that they want to restart in earnest anti-missile defense exercises that haven't taken place over the past 2-3 years. So that would be another step in the direction of stronger cooperation. And I think it's going to be quite interesting to see with the appointment of a human rights, North Korea human rights envoy here in South Korea, where there's going to be more cooperation on this matter as well, because we have seen that over the past few years, this hasn't really been discussed.
Exactly, and of course Japan...
This is an issue the current government feels very strongly.
Exactly. Sorry, we got a bit cut off there. We apologise for that. But so, Dr. Cronin, well, now, as Professor Pacheco-Pardo just mentioned, there are a variety of global geopolitical concerns at the moment. And, well, amid all this, the United States has said that the main theatre of its security operations or relations is very much the Indo-Pacific region. But recently, of course, we've seen Washington's attention divided with competing foreign policy crises in Ukraine, obviously, and also Iran. So how do you think Mr. Biden is going to handle all of these issues? Is this going to lead to reduced tension towards the Indo-Pacific? And what do you think this is going to mean for US allies in the region?
Well, it is a challenge. Europe and Asia are intertwined, but they can drain the resources if you end up with a protracted war that we're trying to support over many years in Europe. There's no doubt that would lead to an end of the pivot 2.0. But I don't see that happening. I see the opposite happening. I think what's happening is that Europe and Asia are finding common ground. They realize that the war in Europe, it could affect the deterrence failure in Asia, Korea or China. So it's very important to cooperate. The summit in Madrid, and both President Yoon, Prime Minister Kishida clearly understood there with President Biden that they're in this together, that we're trying to have a rules-based system and keep the order. So there's more commonality coming, and we're finding that we can cooperate. Korea can cooperate with Europe, with the EU, with NATO, with individual European countries in a way that it shows it's a global power. And Europe can benefit from that on cyber, for instance. There's just so many ways these connections are really about the like-minded countries trying to preserve and adapt the rules-based order for the future.
Professor Pacheco-Pardo, I want to hear your thoughts on this, on the Indo-Pacific and NATO kind of collaboration that we're seeing here. Do you think we saw the two regions or the two US alliances sort of converging at the NATO summit held in Madrid?
I think so. I mean, I had the chance to be in Madrid at the time, and clearly there was a very open discussion about how to cooperate with Japan, with Korea, Australia as well, also very important from a NATO perspective. There was discussion, for example, about arms sales from Korea to NATO members, which is very important for European countries as they try to deter further aggression from China, not only in Ukraine, but potentially beyond Ukraine. There was a strong discussion about cyber, as Dr. Cronin just mentioned, discussion about what NATO do on maritime security, for example, even discussions about potentially NATO presence in the Indian Ocean, or at the very least NATO members, obviously, that are in the Indian Ocean beyond the US, of course. And there was also a discussion, for example, about developing new technologies and how to do this working together with like-minded partners, so Korea, Japan. There was discussion about Taiwan as well, even if not officially. So cooperation with these different countries that share the values of NATO and the European Union as well, of course, and how they can work together with the US to try to build resilient supply chains, which is really more than a buzzword these days.
And as Dr. Cronin mentioned, there are more commonalities between Seoul and Tokyo than their differences right now. And Professor Pacheco-Pardo, what are the main areas that Seoul and Tokyo could very much cooperate on, given all these geopolitical and economic complexities that we're seeing in the world?
Well, we've mentioned North Korea, of course, but I do think that China is going to be a big one. Clearly, the Yoon government doesn't feel comfortable with China's behavior over the past few years, really, and it wants to try to cooperate with other partners, and that includes Japan, on trying to deal with this issue from a security perspective, also from a political perspective, and also from an economic perspective. If we talk about supply chains, for example, I do think there's also going to be probably cooperation on trying to deal with the energy crisis that is really affecting all countries across the world as a result of Russia's aggression of Ukraine. And I think that Korea and Japan may try to find common solutions because they're on the same boat, really, on this issue. And one last aspect that I think we shouldn't forget is that we have seen, for example, recently maritime exercises for impact, right, were led by the US. And I think we're going to see more maritime security cooperation between Korea and Japan, because again, they suffer from the same problems, freedom of navigation issues because of Chinese behavior. So I think that we're going to see cooperation in this area as well.
And when it comes to economic cooperation, Dr. Cronin, well, with Seoul and Tokyo being the linchpin and the cornerstone of the US alliance here in the Indo-Pacific, they were in passionate support of the Indo-Pacific economic framework that was launched earlier in the year, led by the US, of course. But the so-called IPEF, it was very much criticized for lacking a lot of detail, not to mention concrete incentives for participating countries. So what kind of developments do you expect to see in the upcoming ministerial meeting that's slated for later this month?
Well, I'm hoping to see specific countries sign up for specific basket issues, whether it's regarding supply chain resilience or green technology or digital standards. And I also expect to see some priority projects or areas that they want to talk about. This was a deliberately broad framework, and that's why you see 7 Southeast Asian countries who joined this launch, along with Korea and Japan. But it was South Korea and Japan that really make this a meaningful economic framework, because it's not a trade agreement as much as we'd like to see that. It is about setting the standards for the future, and there can be real differences that are made so that we can avoid the values of a surveillance state, for instance, in digital technology, so we don't have predatory economies taking advantage of raw material monopolies that we need for our own high technology, and so that we have this friendshoring that I think Secretary of Treasury Yellen's talking about. We're working with allies and partners, trusted friends, to make sure that we can, in this digital economy of the future, have real predictability and common security.
Well, due to time, I'm afraid that's where we must leave the discussion for today. That was Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London, and Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.